All right, so I could just kick off and we see where we go. So we're here, we're doing the first of probably a series of conversations that will be around this theme of the death and possible rebirth of Europe, in light of an event we're working on as a collaboration between Parallax and Dark Renaissance Productions, for fall of 2026 in Paris. And when we were looking for a name for an event, the death of Europe was something that Andrew came out with, and I think we all intuitively felt like it carried some weight, that it would be something interesting to explore and go deeper into without really knowing what it means or what it points to. Um, I think, I've been writing for the last 9 months or so, a book, really a study of Oswald Spengler, actually for the Parallax guys. And one of the things, his famous book is The Decline of the West. And he's interested in the ways that European culture is becoming increasingly exhausted and sort of flogging a dead horse. And at the same time, its politics is shifting towards a basically a more nakedly imperialist way of existing. He thinks that there's always a sort of a flowering of republicanism and democracy and rational idealism towards the end of a civilization, and then it quickly collapses back into a sort of one of the most brutal forms of imperialism that exists throughout the civilizational arc. So it's not a monarchical aristocratic society so much as a Caesarist society, he calls it, where basically populist men come along, and sort of chances of history, your Napoleons, your Caesars, your Hitlers, possibly your Trumps. Um,
Yeah.
and that seems to be where we're at now. He also predicts a return to religion, a second religiosity. And what's interesting there is how actually Spengler's second religiosity was picked up by the 1950s American beat poets, the guys like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac. And it's fascinating actually. You can go into some of the poetry that those guys were writing, and they're quoting Spengler directly and talking about being tripping on LSD and sharing women and reading Spengler. And of course, those guys feed into the 60s counterculture, which then becomes the undercurrent for a lot of the late 20th century and indeed the 21st century. And now there's the sort of this interesting thing of people saying, well, the counterculture is now swung right wing. It's no longer this sort of progressive, liberal, emancipatory, universalist counterculture, but it's actually more interested in holding on to, say, Western values and civilization while still having this sort of ecstatic Dionysian bent to it. So that's all stuff that's been in the back of my mind for the last year or so. And I think it opens up really nicely onto this question of the death and possible rebirth of Europe or even the West. Um, a sense of having lived through a long, long cycle and things sort of burning out and transforming very, very quickly now. Um, Perhaps that's enough from me. Andrew, did you want to say anything about the death of Europe?
Yeah, that's a good summary. Thank you, Owen, and great to see everybody. I propose that maybe we could do this like I'll do a little bit of a monologue about what I'll think, and then I'll pass it to Raven, and then we can pass it to Tom, and then we can have. Does that sound like a good idea? Then we can have a more open conversation. Yeah. So yeah, I track what you're saying and I follow it. I discovered Spengler through Henry Miller, who was a little bit earlier than Beats. He was sort of a proto Beat. And they were all talking about Spengler and the decline of the West and the decadent old man Europe and this kind of thing. What's interesting is in a period of decay, in a period of decline, in a period of death, when you're in the underworld, so to speak. This is also a very creative period for rebirth, right? So death, you know, in the occult sense and in the religious sense, is not a problem. Death is what happens. Death is something that we should embrace and even fall in love with to a certain extent. So so um, so the decline, the death of Europe means the death of a certain kind of vision of Europe. And in terms of geopolitics, we can comment on that. But what interests me more is like the idea, of Europe and what it represented and what it was, and and how this sort of decline is it's a necessary phase. I would say um, it's necessary for a certain kind of liberalism to to kind of die because it's insufficient. And where I resonate with the most is this rebirth of religiosity. And I distinguish two kinds of religiosity. Let's say the religiosity that's a more exoteric religion, the church coming back and that kind of thing, like the rebirth of Christianity, the death and how Christianity is coming back in the face of Islamic migration and people are starting to understand that you need a religiosity in a society for it to function at all, that the secular world is pretty much it lacks any kind of you know it lacks any kind of energy. Um, so yes, there's a return to religiosity, and this is both extremely dangerous and also necessary. And then on the deeper level, where I find the most hope is in these sort of esoteric schools of wisdom, which have to arise where it might not be directly part of this. It might not be evident what's happening, when you look at the news or when you follow the when you follow the general narrative of the culture war and all this. There's other things happening underneath that might not be on anybody's radar. And so that's very interesting for me. So I guess I'll stop there and pass it to Raven and
Great, thanks, Andrew. Lovely to be here, and I'm really enjoying this process that we're going through together to kind of create this experience, this event that we're moving towards this year. I think for me, something that rhymes with Owen's dive into Spengler, a poetic kind of meditation that I've been doing, is this idea of a civilizational winter. And winter, for me, invokes a way of life, a way of enduring a time of decline. I think that there's a lot missing when you say, okay, like you make a propositional statement of decline that winter brings into the picture, in the sense that, like, with a winter, there's a barrenness, but there's also a life that's enduring beneath that. And also, there's certain things that you start to imagine become necessary, preserving things that may be forgotten or lost, going deep into what is, there's only like a little fragment of it left, keeping things close to you, keeping the hearth fire going. I think that this idea, the poetic idea of winter, is something that's really been inspiring me and has reframed my way of thinking. I think growing up in the US, there's like a very optimistic view. Even now, there's still optimism in the culture, and that tends to be a cultural bias. And therefore, there's this notion of, okay, we're at the top of something, or we're moving towards progress. A summer, let's say. But actually, shifting into this notion of winter, I think is much more accurate, and also allows for a switch in mentality. So that's a lot of what I've been thinking about in regards to, okay, how do we live inside of a period of decline so that we can strap things to our backs and kind of make it through the decline, the winter, and come out the other side. So I think that's something, especially on the level of like artistic inspiration, poetic inspiration, aesthetic inspiration. Winter comes as an object or as a place. Mm. And I think there's also, well, I've been looking into the poetry of William Blake recently. And one of the things that's really an empathy that's emerging for me looking into that era was just how deeply people held their theological beliefs and how intense and violent they were. That their beliefs of God and the way that divinity was held in the soul, these were things people were willing to fight about, and actually held some real violence in the society. For example, if you were not, if you didn't sign up for like 32 precepts of the Church of England, you weren't allowed to study at Cambridge. So Coleridge didn't study at Cambridge, right? So to go against the establishment, to be a heretic actually meant something. And that gives me a view on our kind of ideologically motivated era, that really we're not having deep debates about theology and the nature of our relationship to the divine or the way we should live in a religious manner. It's really an ideological landscape. And I wonder when we talk about a return to religion, is that depth really there yet? Are we really willing to fight for a theological layer, or are we kind of flirting with a religious revival, and maybe at the beginning of it, but it still lacks that type of power? Ideology still reigns, when it comes down to it, at least in this era. So those are things that I've been meditating on recently, that I think are relevant, to this concept or this idea of the death of Europe. I'll pass it to Tom.
Well, I mean, um, the things all of you guys said is very interesting to me. I myself, I'm a little bit torn, I must confess, because I mean, Owen mentioned Oswald Spengler, and there's of course like a whole slew of academics and scholars that study life circles of empires and civilizations, and they're like models that a normal lifespan of an empire or civilization is like 350 to 500 years, and so we are all should get accustomed to the idea that things end, you know, our individual life ends and civilization ends, and this is all fine, and I can deal with this, and I have no problem embracing that kind of idea that some things are dying and in decline. And on the other side, I have this feeling that there is no meta crisis, that there is no meaning crisis. I despise these concepts. I viscerally despise it. And so these are contradictory ideas to me. And I'm between a rock and a hard place there, because you know it's in a way it's also a construct, in a construct in which we participate in with our cognition, with our speech acts and everything. And so for me, it's like, okay, so how do I want to iterate into the future with these people that I consider dear to me, either personally or through projects, right? And then I would ask me, okay, so what kind of values do I want to communicate going into the future? So it's less important to me uh, what the society is doing, because I can't never know this. It's like, is it dying? Is it, where is it? I don't know. Like who has the objective point of view to really say that civilization is in decline, or the civilization is in a meaning crisis or whatnot? It's like, I don't know. We're just guys, we're just people. We're just making things up. And one of the things that every generation had, and Freud was writing a lot about, is this kind of alarmism that every generation and every priest or every, pseudo priest and, prophet of a generation has. Is this kind of this alarmism that society is in decline. That's a current pattern also, and we're not exempt from that. So my feeling, my quest is to situate me and myself and the people I'm with in this kind of vortex, which is this kind of in flux, you know. So yeah, I will die and we all will die and nobody gives a shit in 200 years anyway. And but then again, we construct meaning in every moment. You know, there's no meaning crisis. Even thinking about the meaning crisis creates meaning. So I never find a crisis in meaning, literally. And so to be in this floating kind of constructive vortex, that is the challenge to me, to make it, to project the most positive values into the future.
I want to
That's what
comment
I'm
a little.
thinking.
I want to comment a bit on your objection to the meaning crisis and what part I think is true. I just had a thought that either there's a meaning crisis or or it's not that either there's a meaning crisis or there's not a meaning crisis. There's always crisis. It's like it's the human condition. So it's not like we're going into some crisis. It's like the human condition is a crisis. Humanity is a crisis. Humanity is a problem, And we're in the underworld right now. We're not like this is the underworld. So people are always looking for this perfect utopian better world. But before that could be the horror of the situation, as Gurdjieff would call it, needs to be fully grasped, not the problem I see with the meaning crisis is it gives you too much hope. It's like, oh, we can go beyond the meaning crisis and make a better world. Well, yeah, we can make the world a lot better and a lot worse, but we're kind of we're in a state of perpetual crisis, and it's not just historically now. It's from the first sort of from when Cain murdered Abel. It begins it begins at the beginning of the human story. So that's my
I think perhaps how I'd reframe the meaning crisis would be a crisis of history and of narrative. You just mentioned myth there, Andrew. Obviously, Alexander's done a lot of work on narratology. I think what I think people almost intuitively have you could say, a view of history, whether that comes from religion or whether that comes from secular progressivism or somewhere else. So a sense of where we came from and where we're going to. Religiously, that would be we came from the beginning, and in the case of the Abrahamic religions, God gave the meaning and the values there, and we're falling away from them, but we can re-enchant them, we can return to them. That's sort of basically the Old Testament through the Israelites falling away and then coming back, falling away and then coming back. What has emerged over the last, say, 400 to 500 years in the West is the progressive view of getting better forever. Materially, machinically, rationally, peacefully, blah, 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 blah. And there's the 20th century, beginning with the Great Wars and then right up to the explosion of the internet, has sort of shaken a lot of the faith, you could say, in things just intuitively getting better. And I think the meaning crisis, I would frame as people recognizing, oh, right, our story, our philosophy of history is kind of broken down. A sense of that came especially after the victory or the end of the Cold War, that the West is forever. That's no longer secure. And then it's like, all right, what is the story then? Where did we come from and where are we going? And that begins to sort of frame this meaning crisis, which then gets psychologized and individualized as being a crisis of meaning, whereas it's more, I think, a crisis of direction and temporality. And that's what I think Raven bringing in the framing of winter is useful, because again, that does bring in this sense of where we've gone to and where we're at and where we might be going. Time is back in the picture, as opposed to, say, just a subjective experience of despair and disorientation and confusion.
Yeah, I mean, I would also say that, like, So many of these things are symptomatic of being in a globalized civilization and then also like just abundance. When I think about crisis, I think about like magnitude, like earthquakes or floods or whatever. There's like variation in how serious the crisis is. Sometimes the flood just moves up into the riverbank, and sometimes it moves up into the floodplain, and sometimes you built your farmhouse in the floodplain, and then it takes out everything that you've been building, right? And that magnitude of crisis is part of how we calibrate stability and a sense of continuity. But in the end, of course, the history is full of crisis. But when you hook everybody up into a global civilization, that crisis starts to become this kind of constantly moving and shifting and disorienting kind of form that people are all responding to. And in that moment, I think the concept of winter maybe becomes even more important. And if you think about winter as finding a place of scarcity, of finding a place of withdrawal from these forces in order to preserve or maintain through this crisis. I think it is an analogy for what people who are trying to achieve excellence in this era have to do. You have to get off TikTok. You have to stop looking at trends. You have to stop being caught up in all of the different attention grabbing forces. You have to impose limits on yourself because even if you're someone living basically in poverty, you can spoil yourself. You can get McDonald's every day. You can, max out your credit card and have a nice car. You can live beyond your means, right? So, like, the spiritual corruption of abundance is one of the things that, like, more people at scale are dealing with. And I think that's one of the things that people are like they project a meaning crisis onto that. They're like, oh, I have so many choices. I have so many things I could do.
Mm.
How do I find myself? And it's like, okay, like you have to find your winter, the thing that you're willing to sacrifice everything for, to go deep into something and to preserve something through all of the chaos. And that is something of a spiritual quest because it requires an active choice. It's not something imposed on us by a religious order, by scarcity, economic scarcity. It's really kind of the story of like the spoiled child, the child living in privilege, having to find a way to seek enlightenment. Like, this story of the Buddha, right? Being a prince who rejects that life to find spiritual awakening.
Well, it's so interesting what you say about projection because I don't know who of you have read Deleuze and Guattari Anti-Oedipus. And so there are two things that are in my mind and that I find super interesting because we have, like, for example, this kind of notion of capitalism, which is like a closed up system. And they break with this idea. They say this is you can't say where a capitalism starts. It starts with our body. It starts with a natural flow of things, with everything, and it's a natural system in a kind of way. And so we are embedded in all these kinds of natural systems, and these natural systems have contradictions in them. Naturally, they're kind of schizophrenic. But what happens in history is that, according to Deleuze and Guattari, that we invent psychoanalysis. And so psychoanalysis gives you the illusion that it's your fault that you have these contradictions and you must solve them, right? So we're like in these systems and we're experiencing contradictions. I mean, for example, capitalism is like it frees you from traditional gender roles, but then it obligates you to buy new fashion stuff, or you're supposed in terms of politics to say yeah, acknowledge the diverse DY diversity rule, but you're on the other side never allowed to say what's different and what makes you diverse. So that's a conflict. It's like, why are these different cultures diverse? You celebrating? Is it IQ? Oh no, you're a bigot talking about this. And so, okay, so now it's your problem. And then because psychoanalysis, urges you to make everything your problem. And then when you're engulfed into this, you see what everything you see is kind of, you slide from one trauma and one neurosis into the other one. It's everything has to do with your past experiences or what your daddy did to you or what your mommy did to you. When she flicked your little penis when you were a child, whatever. It's like everything is trauma and everything has to be stopped. It's like, no, that's the problem. There is no inherent meaning crisis. It's just a projection that comes about because systems like, according to Deleuze and Guattari, systems like capitalism are basically in cahoots with psychoanalysis, right? And so that's the interesting thing to me, because you can't talk about psychology nowadays without making everything a problem. It's like, really? Like, no, I don't want to think that way.
Interesting. Yeah. I I think it's brilliant that Raven framed the Buddha's awakening as the spoiled child. That's absolutely brilliant. I'm going to remember that forever. Uh, as a Vajrayana Buddhist, yes, it's the awakening of the spoiled child. I love that. Um, I also think that that's one part of the story is the Buddha's individual kind of awakening, right? And that is the more attractive side of the story for Western individualist types of people. That's why they gravitate to sort of Eastern spirituality because it's about in personal awakening or enlightenment. And there's something wrong with that as an entire worldview. It's not the whole story because we're also again I could bring in Bard and we're also tribes in a sense. And the reason that I noticed that I think the religiosity in some way has to come back, and I don't mean like the old, you know, dogmas and church and that kind of thing, but actual religious community has to come back is firstly because people make babies, when they go to church, it's just a fact, that the fertility, this is one of the big problems with the West and with the spoiled child syndrome is that, women don't have babies till they're like 40 and there's not enough life going on. People have become severely depressed. So if I think of the meaning crisis, I think it's the spoiled child syndrome and and the depression, of the West. Because I do feel that that's, even in places where there's real crisis, not just psychological, individual angst that there's this that people can live with vitality, they can live with energy, and that's probably because they belong to something, like they might belong to a temple or a religion or a group of people who are guided towards a common goal, and they have an intense direction and meaning, and that's a given, right? OG Rose talks about the fact that the givens are sort of like people don't know what to do, right? It's like a Hamlet. It's like indecision. What do I do? What's what to be or not to be? So we just eat and we consume Netflix and because we don't know what to be. And so again, this is why I kind of think that I think that there is something about just this individual spiritual quest, hero journey thing that's really it's important, but it's only half of the story.
Hmm. I want to try and weave a bit of that with what Tom was saying as well about psychoanalysis, and also about my thinking in the genesis of this event, even, which is that I think we sort of lived through the meaning crisis years, which started, say, 2016, 2017, and created this big subcultural explosion, first with the intellectual dark web. And I was super influenced by Jordan Peterson. Raven was a student of Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying at Evergreen College. Loads of us were on YouTube and getting connected through that. Then these sort of smaller subcultural movements formed. Andrew and I doing men's work with Manifesto and the guys, which are sort of synthesizing the sort of Jordan Peterson wave and Nietzschean inspiration and all of this. And now I have this sense that as good as that sort of subcultural thing was, it's kind of exhausted itself. And these ideas, and I think this is what we're getting to, that ideas, say, of meaning crisis don't really carry the same weight or at least the same promise of even salvation that they used to have. And Tom, perhaps you're wise in that this this over application of psychoanalysis, which implies that you're responsible and can solve these things, perhaps. This framing did come out ultimately of Western psychology and Western academia, kind of renegade academics and psychologists, but still people very much brought up within that paradigm. And I think implicit within the meaning crisis, the game B, all of this stuff was a sense of, if we can think this through properly and get enough people talking about this and thinking about this and practicing around this, we'll be fine. We'll solve the crisis. We'll get through somehow, and we'll get through to the other side. And it will be fixed somehow. The contradictions, the problems will be resolved. We'll enter the new paradigm. And that's the thing to aim for. Where perhaps, where certainly where I feel confronting now is that that wind has sort of died down, and there's a sense, I've said to you guys, of almost just being in a boat adrift at sea. It's almost like Coleridge's image of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, when the wind has just stopped and everything's how the ocean's just there, and it's like, okay, we're here, and we have to just sort of like be here in the storm, in the cold, in the winter that Raven's talking about, and live there, and and perhaps without the clutching at the sense of resolving it, and I've also, interestingly, this critique of psychoanalysis coming up, been thinking a lot about Werner Herzog recently, the filmmaker. And he's got some great interviews where he's there saying, psychoanalysis is the disease of our time.
Yeah.
Think they are disease, and I wish they would all go to an island and psychoanalyze themselves and leave the rest of us alone. Um, and other, but elsewhere, he's talking about, he part of his, I think, philosophy of creativity is he thinks we lack adequate images. Give us adequate images, and his inspiration
Mm.
behind creating his films is to try and create adequate images for the present, images that reflect, I suppose, the existential weight of man in this moment. And I certainly know that there's wings of psychoanalysis that don't like images at all. They hate images and view them as sort of a type of primordial regression or return to a sort of narcissistic relationship ultimately with the mother. Of course, that's the whole framing. But I think religion is, rather, images everywhere in religion, whether it's stained glass paintings or whether it's the image that Andrew's got behind him, right? These images that tell more than words, than intellectual framings, than stories can. And it's image that has been banished from our intellectual and academic culture in favor of thesis and argument. And I think image has been sort of kept and clung to by the occult underground that has been active for centuries, but sort of continued throughout the 20th century as an undercurrent, the sort of underbelly of academia, in that people who were interested in esotericism, in even Spengler, Evola, Guénon, William Butler Yeats, have often, especially in the esoteric sides of them, have been underground and hidden, and now are starting to emerge into the light just because of the internet, at the same time that the academic world, with its reliance on thesis and argument, is running out of answers. And I see us as being somewhere at that point, actually, in that we kind of tapped into the meaning crisis wave which came out of academia. But I think really what unites us and our interest in our events and our writing is this grounding in the symbolic and the imagistic and the occult and the ritual and the ceremonial, as much as in the argumentative.
Totally. And I think this is where Zizek and that whole movement kind of gets stuck. It gets stuck in a kind of Protestantism. And Protestantism tends to view image making as idolatrous. And so does Islam, by the way. Like you can only make geometrical forms, right? You can't do anthropomorphic imagery, right? Whereas the Catholic Church preserves and some of that, some of this sort of pagan image making, um, and most of it is sort of repressed and pushed into pop culture as Paglia points out so often. So I think we're dealing with intense Protestantism in the West. Zizek, he ends up at atheist Christianity, which I can't think of anything more sterile and worse than that. Um, and, and, and this is just like think the rational is the real, the propositional, blah blah blah. It's like no, I've been screaming out no in my being every time I hear this kind of discourse, because it's so incomplete. And I think Owen, you're bang on about that the need and you made me understand why Herzog has always been one of my favorite filmmakers because he prioritized the image over the blah blah the solution the discourse the proposition the endless verbal diarrhea of theory into something because an image is it the the story has to be full of imagery otherwise it doesn't have any gravity or weight. Does that make any sense what I'm saying?
Well, one interesting thing, I mean, maybe I'm able to tie all this together. But I was just we talked about this last time, and I'm reading Sexual Persona from Camille Paglia right now. And apart from the content, what's really interesting is the whole futileness of that program. Because I mean, she was a huge best-selling author in the 90s, and literally nothing of what she kind of proposed solved anything. It got worse, literally. Everything that she described got worse in society. But she was huge, right? And so, but this is basically like a generation before us. And so I feel like there's a quote by Nietzsche. I found it yesterday. And he says there's no greater purpose than to how do you translate this? To fail with the big and impossible, right? And so, to I don't know. I don't know of anything that we can strive for will make any sense. Any solution, any proposition, if that will change anything. You know, but we have to try anyway, and that's what I find interesting because it's kind of affirming the futileness and maybe the occult. What you said, the we don't know, but it also addresses the kind of heroic and the rejuvenation of life.
I mean, you can't have rejuvenation or the heroic without this winter that Raven is speaking about. So the winter is equally as part of the totality as the spring. People get very excited in the spring, and then with about revolution or something. People want this revolution or they want this radical revolutionary change, and it's a youthful vision of the world. Um, if one is not willing to endure the winter, you know.
I think one of the strange things with Paglia, um, it's maybe strange is not the right framing, but I think about this a lot because she's one of my major influences. She's kind of the great writer on European romanticism, but she actually has almost nothing to say about modernism. And she takes romanticism then into 20th century pop culture and pop music and television and cinema. And she writes great, fantastic work on it as being the continuation of the European 19th century, 18th century Gothic, and so on. But when it comes to, say, um, modernist literature or painting, or, and particularly, and this is where I'm going to go with this, say, Soviet modernism or Caucasian modernism, she just, as far as I know, doesn't have anything to say. And neither in my sort of cursory reading, say, of Nick Land and Mark Fisher, the CCRU, the sort of other great cultural theorist block of the late 20th century, they don't have that much to say about this area either. And I'm becoming more and more fascinated by, you could say, this sort of like Caucasian Eastern modernism, especially with its religious elements. So I was just in Georgia last week in Tbilisi, and I went to their Museum of Fine Arts there in Tbilisi. It's actually a private collection started by a couple of people, a couple of rich people. They bought up all these paintings from the last 80 years. And we were walking through it. The gallery was empty, just us in it. And the paintings were as good as many of the paintings in Florence, these visionary, famous Renaissance paintings that are deeply mystical and spiritual, the Raphaels and your Da Vinci's and all of this. Except this was stuff that's all been done in the last 80 years. And it seems like what at least the Georgian school had done was taken all of the innovations of modernism that were coming out of Europe and indeed out of Russia, color and form and cubism and just smushing everything up. But they didn't take the European nihilism that went along with it. So there's still a deep engagement with folk custom and with sort of like beautiful archetypal women, beautiful landscapes, scenes from the New Testament, crucifixions. There's a hilarious painting I was just looking at yesterday where this guy basically painted a bunch of people carrying placards of Stalin and Lenin, dwarfed by the Georgian landscape. And they just looked like tiny little bugs surrounded by the land. And it's beautiful and it's stunning. And at its beginning, there was a sort of an ethos to it in that it was a resistance against the increasing socialist realism that was pushed by the Soviet Union, sort of saying everything has to reflect reality and our utopian vision on it. And they took the modernism, but they also took the subject of deep history um, to 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 break out of that. But it's still inspiring painters decades later. And I mean to study it more because I've not seen this in the West. I've not seen this embrace of the latest sort of techniques. Here we're talking painting, of course, but tying it into the deep and the archetypal and the transhistorical and all of that. And I think there's something to be learned in that, as opposed to our sort of nihilistic European modernism, which has embraced perpetual revolution of media and form, but at the sacrifice of anything beyond that. It has just become this art for art's sake. And I think AI art, which is having its sort of moment in the sun at the moment, is the ultimate sort of apotheosis of this meaninglessness of Western modernism, which is just endlessly producing images that mean nothing and are thrown away. And at best, they're sort of funny. My joke is that AI is basically at its best when it's bathroom stall graffiti, that you look at it and you have a chuckle while you're dropping your trousers. That's the best it can achieve. Anything that's got any more pretensions than that fails because there is no imagistic weight to it. And that there's something in these other regions, though, that are sort of straddling East and West that is richer.
Hmm. I'm
Yeah,
glad you brought up
go
the
ahead.
elephant in the room. AI. I think it is one of these like dawning, uh, ubiquitous kind of technological integrations that it's certainly having its accelerating effects. Both, it's really difficult to give a general prognosis because on the one hand, I think many of the rots that you're speaking of, let's say of kind of Western nihilism and the reproduction of empty images, even the postmodern turn towards this like ironic representation, just putting a chair in a gallery and saying, oh, really, the meaning is about the frame. It's not really about the content. If we just put this thing here and then all look at it together critically, somehow this is elevated to an artistic experience. And, the rest of us are all looking at each other going, is this for real? Like, is this for real? And I think that moment mm, of is this for real is excel like that mentality is actually growing and consuming more and more of the psychic space. That stance is seen as tired, it's seen as boring, it's seen as overplayed, it's seen as a fad, the fad that it really was. And now I do think that people in all industries, in order to be successful as an artist, as a fashion designer, as a playwright, there's a need for craft, like a deep understanding of the materiality of the form that you're working with, and seclusion, so that you can find a deep source of inspiration that's not because of the whatever material, the detritus, the artifacts of social interaction that's clogging up all of the attention landscape. That's what everyone is doing. In order to seek genuine inspiration, you need to withdraw from those inputs and go into something strange, genuinely otherworldly. It's as if like the otherworldly is scarce and you have to really seek it in order to make contact with it. And to be a visionary artist, designer, any of these archetypes, and to genuinely compete at a high level, you have to tap into some sort of very deep and hidden force, which requires quite a bit of. You can maybe it's a spirit, maybe I don't know what you would say it, but it's certainly a willpower that's needed to do these things. And in that sense, you could see that this dark age of whatever, nihilism, abundance, and now AI kind of turbocharging this superficiality is potentially the dawn of the rebirth, right? It's like the capacity to just like push everything to the limit. And then those of us that have our heads above water saying, like, no, we renounce that. We're not touching that. Or I only, I only use AI for my thumbnails or whatever it is. Or the graffiti on the bathroom stall. That these become limits that are not held by law. I think this is another really interesting quality of like living in a time where there have been no real social limits. At least in this society, Europe is a bit of a different story, but in the US, there's just really not that many limits. If you want to live, you know, as a tranny and you want to have multiple identities and you want to, be inside of some sort of alternative sexuality scene, that's completely within your range. If you want to be a religious fundamentalist, that's within your range. Like there's no real limits on what you can do. And in that sense, there's a kind of exhaustion that comes from that possibility. And now I think that at least, and maybe this is actually an artifact of living in Sweden, because in Sweden you don't have those same laws and rules. There's a lot of things that mm, govern people's behavior that are based on the society, not on the law, based on the way that people view each other and judge each other. And I think in a way that's what will determine different artistic scenes, for example. Some scenes will be like, oh, it's really cool to make AI art. We really like that. We think that's great. AI music, fantastic. Love it. Let's just all share our AI slop. And then there'll be other artists that are like completely renouncing those things. And that will kind of be part of these lines in the sand that differentiate different communities who are working with these tools. How do you work with the tools? How does it influence the final object, the final performance? Where do you place them? because all of those things will be judged in order for the person experiencing it to know, is this real or not? Is this something that you made? Or is it something that the machine you kind of nudged the machine to make on your behalf? And I think, I don't know if you guys like see AI in any of these, in any of this kind of winter or what its possibilities are, but it does feel like to me it's a big object to try and reckon with, especially as artists and image makers.
Yeah, I kind
Sure.
of take a McLuhan analysis of that. Like it pushes people towards craft. It's interesting. Like something is, if the tetrad, and something is restored that is lost. So because of the winter, of the barrenness, of the deadness of cultural productions, this pushes this small amount of people with integrity towards craft. And also I would add just one thing to you what you're saying because I agree with everything. There has to be also a lineage of craft.
Yeah,
Master crafts person passing it on in some kind of a way. So I think people need to rediscover a lineage. I see that kind of in American music. People are playing all these old forms of music, like bluegrass and stuff that was considered really archaic or old-fashioned. It's becoming what is the most interesting because they go back and they learn from the masters and then then there's something and then they have something new to say rather than just kind of this infantile 60s blank slate thing where you just play and create and there's something about the 60s that has to die in my opinion with all its glory and all of the interesting things that it created. It kind of threw away lineage and that's a problem.
totally. I think
Yeah,
lineage is
then,
really critical. Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
no, please go ahead.
I was just saying, I think lineage in all of these different domains, lineage for poetry, like for I'm finding myself, and I've always been, um, let's say, proficient in English. I'm better than average English speaker, even as a native speaker. But now I feel like as I'm seeing these, it's like as ChatGPT has this like way of speaking and influencing also the way that I think about how I speak. I want to move deeper into the English language. I want to read the great poets because I know that that slop is actually creating an impression in my mind and in the way that I speak. Sometimes I notice when I'm trying, texting a roommate or whatever, I add these little questions like, and can I help you with that? Or would you like to do that next? Or it's like little, I'm like, oh my God. I sound like ChatGPT. And it's not like that's always bad, but it is necessary, I think, to notice and then to, at least for me, it's actually prompting deeper inspiration to become more intimate with the lineage of the English language. And that's just one example that I have of my own experience, but I think that that's happening to people across the board.
I mean, the interesting thing is that, AI is so empty and void of any weight, basically, but it creates a space where something with weight and depth can emerge, And I mean, reading Paglia is the way she emphasizes that, all these pagan forces, archetypes, and narratives, they kind of create and shape our lives independently of if we want it or not. They just do, and nothing of the modern world is uh, an island. It's deeply informed by these pagan forces, but these pagan forces are not up to our decision. I mean, it's like she talks at length about the Third Reich and the architects and the design and everything about it is so it's so pagan in a way, the architecture and the elevated arm of the salute, which is like a throwback to, the Apollo gesture of pointing to the future. And so it's like, but there was nobody who came up with that design. It's like, oh, let's do it that way. That was like that kind of pagan force that just re-emerged and grabbed hold of a whole nation. And I think what AI is enabling is like, okay, it creates some space where some new or old pagan forces can reemerge and grab our attention. But we have to let it breathe in a kind of way, and we have to dare to look into the abyss to see what's coming out of that, and then to play with these forms. I don't think we can purposely, invoke or elicit like a certain archetype, but I think this is far beyond our control. But I mean, what we can do, we can just stare a little bit at it and enable it and see the forms that are coming out of the occult, basically. But I think that's interesting. That's the interesting thing with AI. That is occupying everybody's mind, but that's not what's adding weight to us. Like, we have to wait for the proper forms to emerge, the old forms.
I think this bringing up of form is so crucial. This is one of it's sort of in Spengler's deep work. He's really the decline of the West is the decline of form. So the other stuff is superficial, and form is precisely what Raven's talking about when she's talking about the implicit norms and judgments that, say, people in Sweden have that aren't written down anywhere, but they make Sweden Sweden and make Swedish interaction feel different from German interaction or English interaction. It's what Andrew's talking about when he's talking about that transmission from guru to disciple, from master to pupil, where it's the subtleties about how you move your finger on the guitar neck or how you sort of move your hand away from the neck on the final note that will never ever be written down anywhere. They're only picked up by watching a master at work and copying it and making it your own and feeling the way with it. It's
He hits you on the fucking back of the head if you don't do it right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You get this, and also the master, right? The master sees you as like, okay, your hand is completely uniquely shaped. So there's sort of a universal guidebook that you can follow, but you are going to have types of expression. You're going to excel at certain types of for if we're using music, you're going to excel at playing certain styles and be terrible at playing other styles. If you're a dancer, you're going to excel at certain dances and suck at others. If you're an actor, you're going to play Henry V well, but you're going to be a terrible Macbeth. And you need someone who's able to actually see you, see what you look like, see how you interact with the world, and bring that weight of the tradition, which is a form, and shape you with that. And unfortunately, the education systems and the AI and internet based information systems don't do that. They don't have this intuitive grasp of form. It simply fills heads up with knowledge. And that's what we have now, a glut of knowledge. My God, I was on a plane the other day for 5 hours on the way back from Georgia, and there was a guy talking, and he was the perfect embodiment of a clever idiot. The person who knows everything and is just so stupid. And there's no wisdom, there's nothing intelligent, there's nothing interesting in what's being said. In England, people do pub quizzes a lot. It's like the guy who knows every answer to the pub quiz. He knows every piece of trivia and general knowledge, but it's just, you don't want to have a beer with that guy.
Yeah,
Right.
because we can confuse intellectual prowess with ontological depth. Somebody could be a complete intellectual idiot and be extremely deep, zero IQ and be have an extremely deep sensibility. We tend to be I think, and again, I want to come back to what you said about images because I think that's exactly right. I think images are complex and deep and bring us into a ritual and sensual relationship with life. Ideas are just the beginning. They're not the end of the end. And we kind of think that thoughts and thought forms are cleverly constructed thought forms are everything. And they're like not even 1% of what matters in a work of art, for instance, especially. Even in literature, what's not being said is what's really being said. So I guess it's a question of we're in this hyper we're the McLuhan's kind of the visual word-based text-based culture uh it is dying and a new culture is being born and we're in between the two. And so the story we have to tell is a story which brings back tradition but also brings forth image. I think that's right. I'm struggling here, but because there's a lot more to say, but hmm. About image, like that's a whole other podcast, I would say, talking about uh the our particular time and its toxic effects on our consciousness, and how to develop a consciousness that is able to be deeply to 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 be able to deeply imbue the sacred again. Um, I'm bringing back the sacred into the equation.
Well, very briefly mentioning Herzog again, I think I'm not sure if it's the same interview or if it's another one, but he said that everybody, and this must have been in the 70s, the 80s, everybody talks about the nuclear crisis, but we don't talk about the equal crisis in images. I think the problem of nukes is equal to the problem of images we have.
There you go. Yeah,
God, love that guy. Mm, yeah.
me too. Yeah. So I think we're going to have to sort of round off this discussion. Does anybody have any final thoughts, summaries?
Work is not yet done. There's more to be said.
The work. Gurdjieff talked about the work.
I
And,
want to talk
and
more
what he
about
mean,
the
what he meant by work, the work is the spiritual work, right? Not in this cheesy new agey kind of way, but in the sense of total ontological transformation. Mm.
Yeah, I would think we should, I would love to go more into that next time because having had this experience with the Georgian artists, and of course, Gurdjieff was Armenian, right? Just next door to the Georgians.
Mm.
And I've
Do you
said
know, do
this,
you know his music? Have you heard his music?
yeah, 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 I've
Mm.
listened to his music. And I know that you guys are into him and have been doing work on him. And now having seen the art being produced by that region of the world in the 20th century, I'm going, okay, right. There's something happening there that I think I need to go more into. And this is topic for another podcast, definitely. Um, Maybe I'll say just on more practical terms. There is an event coming up towards the end of this year. Look out for tickets for it. We will be doing more conversations and we will be selling tickets as soon as we can.